Hello, good evening, and welcome to this episode of The Last Clue. I hope everyone in the family is doing well and taking care of each other. Friends, today's episode is based on a political story. You must have understood that from the thumbnail, so let's begin. The conflict between Iran and Israel is still ongoing. This week, Donald Trump made a bold statement, claiming they know the exact location of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. He said it would be easy for him to find and eliminate him. Trump warned Iran to surrender or else face serious consequences. He even mentioned that a final decision about Iran's fate will be made in 2 weeks, a direct and dangerous threat. Now, let's talk about a country somewhere in the world. If something has gone wrong there, keep this in mind. Whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, the story remains the same: conflict, chaos, and power plays. Now let's turn our focus to India and Pakistan. After Operation Sindoor, when tensions flared and drone strikes were exchanged between the two nations, Donald Trump was the president of the United States. He claimed, not once but nearly 20 times, that it was America that halted the war, that it was his administration that enforced the ceasefire. Meanwhile, India has consistently denied any involvement of the United States in mediating the situation. Pakistan, on the other hand, made the first public move. Their Director General of Military Operations stated they would de-escalate. Yet Trump continued to emphasize that it was his threat to disrupt trade that forced both nations to step back and bring the conflict to a halt. They always want to take the credit. Anywhere in the world, if there's a conflict, have you ever wondered why America is the first to jump in? Be it Syria, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, any Middle Eastern nation, or even countries in Africa and South America like Venezuela, whenever trouble brews, the United States shows up, flexing its power. But have you ever questioned why? It's just like those days back in school or college, when two groups would get into a fight, and the third group would barge in, act like the boss, and force a decision that suited them. Criminal gangs operate the same way. And in many ways, America's actions mirror that same pattern of dominance, imposing itself where it benefits the most. The moment the dominance of the US dollar ends and some other currency takes its place as the global standard, America's power will collapse, and with it, its data gyre will disappear. But the big question is that even possible? Today's story is built around a few key developments, and if you grasp them, you'll understand the bigger picture. Right now, it's the year 2024. A major Brics summit took place, involving nations like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and new additions like Iran, along with invited countries such as the UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia. During this summit, something significant happened. Russian President Vladimir Putin put forward a bold proposal: a new Brics currency. The idea was simple but revolutionary. All Brics nations would use a common currency for trade, aiming to reduce their dependency on the US dollar. The currency you're looking at now is the same one that Putin proposed at the summit. What's even more surprising is that not just Brics nations, but several other countries also supported this idea. So what does this new currency really mean? It means that Brics member states and the nations aligning with them will carry out trade using the Brics currency instead of the US dollar. This move directly challenges the dollar's global dominance. And if this trend continues, there's a real possibility that many other countries around the world might also shift toward this new currency. India is part of this initiative too. By supporting the creation of a shared Brics currency, these nations have essentially thrown down the gauntlet to the United States. In response, Donald Trump made a strong statement. Any country that dares to promote Brics currency and undermine the dollar will face a brutal economic penalty. He threatened to impose a 150% tariff, which is basically a heavy tax on their exports. This trade war has already begun taking shape. Now, when this Brics currency was introduced, a natural question arose. how would it compare to other global currencies? Like we often ask, how much is one US dollar in Indian rupees? Right now, for example, it might be around 86 rupees per dollar, showing how much our currency has weakened. So if a Brics currency comes into play, people assumed it too would be compared against the dollar. But the member nations decided otherwise. They chose not to peg it to the US dollar at all. So then how would its value be determined? The solution was unique. They agreed to base 40% of the Brics currency's value on gold. The idea was to calculate how much gold each Brics country and its allied members hold in reserves. That gold would form a solid base for the currency. The remaining 60% would be derived from the collective value of the national currencies of Brics and associated countries. In short, Brics currency would be backed by 40% gold and 60% the weighted value of its member nations' currencies, creating a completely new standard outside of the dollar's influence. Now, since the Brics currency is to be backed by gold, that's where the real story begins. After 2017, India quietly started ramping up its gold reserves. The gold market saw a noticeable shift, and by 2024, India had become the world's second largest gold buyer. It was the Reserve Bank of India, RBI, that led this surge in purchasing. Now think about it, if countries like India, Russia, and China, all key Brics members, continue accumulating gold, then 40% of the Brics currency's value would be securely backed by their reserves. The remaining 60% will be based on their economic strength and GDP. Combined, this could create a currency strong enough to rival the dollar. And this is exactly where America gets alarmed. Why are these nations suddenly hoarding so much gold? If you examine global gold holdings, the top 8 countries tell an interesting story. At the very top sits the United States with a massive reserve of 8,133 tons of gold. Germany follows with 3,355 tons, while Italy holds the third spot with about 2,451 tons. These figures reveal why gold remains central to global financial power and why the Brics gold push is making America nervous. Many countries have even opened branches of their banks in India, which shows growing international confidence. So when India says it will trade in its own currency, the Indian rupee, it's making a direct statement against the dominance of the US dollar. It's saying, we no longer need the dollar to do business. Now take something like oil, which America controls heavily in global trade. There's a major downside to using dollars in such transactions. For example, if you're buying oil from Iran or importing goods from Russia, and the payment is made in dollars, you not only pay the amount but also the dollar's exchange rate. That added cost increases the burden. Imagine someone in India is sending money to the US with a dollar at around 86 rupees. They have to buy dollars at one rate and sell rupees at another, often pushing the effective rate to 88 or more. It becomes costly. But if the trade is done in Indian currency, this entire exchange rate cost is avoided. It's cheaper, more efficient, and a strategic blow to the dollar's global monopoly. It's not just about pride, it's about saving enormous amounts of money. We're talking crores and crores of rupees that India could retain simply by trading in its own currency. Now, if India and the Brics nations succeed in launching their own unified currency, it will fundamentally challenge the relevance of the US dollar. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. Many people may not know this, but what India proposed in 2022, trading in rupees, and Brics planning to introduce its own currency to counter the dollar's monopoly, isn't just some futuristic dream. It's rooted in history. There was a time when the Indian rupee held such value that it was accepted as legal tender across several Middle Eastern nations. That's right, Indian currency circulated in places like Oman, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. This was during and after British rule. Even after India gained independence in 1947, and these Gulf nations became sovereign. They continued to use the Indian rupee until around 1960. Just imagine, our currency was once so strong it was used beyond our borders as a regional standard. Now, if Brics succeeds in creating a similar model for a joint currency, it could deliver a powerful blow to the US dollar. And here's the economic punchline. Brics nations today account for around 37% of the world's total GDP. Countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, and newer invitees like UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia together hold over a third of the planet's economic output. The remaining 63% comes from the rest of the world. That means Brics isn't just symbolic, it's a real economic force with the potential to shift the balance of global power. Besides GDP, Brics nations also represent a massive share of the world's population, about 45%. With India and China alone making up nearly 1/3 of the global population, the influence of Brics becomes even more significant. So if these countries begin trading in their own currencies, like the Indian rupee, what happens to the US dollar? As Brics moves to back its currency with gold and India announces its intention to conduct international trade in rupees, it's natural that the US would feel threatened. But this isn't just economic theory. It has historical parallels. Consider Libya and Colonel Gaddafi. In 2011, NATO forces launched a military intervention in Libya, resulting in Gaddafi's death. Before that, Libya was a relatively stable and wealthy nation. Today, it's been reduced to poverty and instability. The official narrative was about human rights violations and dictatorship, but the deeper truth points elsewhere. Gaddafi had taken a bold step, much like what Brics is doing now. He proposed a gold-backed currency called the Libyan gold dinar. His plan was to use this dinar for trade with African and friendly nations, bypassing the US dollar entirely. At the time, Gaddafi was also leading the African Union, which included countries like Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Angola. The moment these nations began supporting the idea of abandoning the dollar in favor of a gold-backed dinar, alarm bells rang in Washington. Soon after, it was discovered that Libya had accumulated around 150 tons of gold, enough to actually back such a currency. And not long after that, Gaddafi was gone. The message was clear. Any move that threatens the dollar's supremacy invites serious consequences. Not just gold, but Libya had also stored a significant amount of silver, about 150 tons combined. With that reserve, Colonel Gaddafi was preparing to launch the Libyan gold dinar, a currency backed by real assets. The goal was to use it for international trade instead of the US dollar. Had this plan succeeded, it would have severely undercut the dollar's dominance and, by extension, America's global influence. That's when the US saw its opportunity. Accusations of human rights violations were quickly brought against Gaddafi, and soon after, NATO forces intervened. His government was toppled, and Libya, once a relatively prosperous nation, is now plagued by instability. Why? Because Libya dared to challenge the dollar with its own currency. That was just one example. The second came years earlier, involving Saddam Hussein. The world was told that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical and nuclear arms. The US repeated this claim again and again, but to this day, no such weapons have ever been found in Iraq. Still, the country was invaded. Saddam was captured, tried in a questionable court setup, and ultimately hanged. But the real motive had little to do with weapons. It traces back to a key moment. On September 24, 2000, Saddam convened his cabinet and made a bold decision. He would stop selling Iraqi oil in US dollars and switch to the euro. Just 3 months after that announcement, the groundwork for the Iraq invasion began. It wasn't about WMDs, it was about protecting the dollar's grip on global oil trade. Iraq had already made it clear, No more trading in US dollars. Saddam Hussein had even converted all of Iraq's dollar reserves held in American banks into euros. On top of that, Iraq had built up a solid gold reserve. The plan was simple: bypass the dollar entirely and shift oil trade to euros. This move directly threatened the dollar's value and, once again, sent alarm bells ringing in Washington. The US needed a pretext, and it came in the form of allegations, claims of weapons of mass destruction, chemical attacks, and human rights violations. Using these accusations, NATO forces launched a full-scale assault on Iraq, eventually capturing and executing Saddam Hussein. Today, Iraq is in ruins, crippled by poverty and instability. But Iraq wasn't the only target. Venezuela was next. After a US-favored candidate lost the Venezuelan elections, America pushed for another vote aligned with its interests. When that didn't happen, Washington slapped economic sanctions on Venezuela, cutting it off from using the dollar in international trade. This meant Venezuela's currency became practically worthless on the global stage. Since 96% of global trade runs through the US dollar, no nation, including India, was willing to engage in transactions with Venezuela. Their economy collapsed under the pressure. Only after Venezuela gave in and adjusted to US demands were some of those restrictions lifted. All of this paints a clear picture. There's a long history of economic bullying tied directly to dollar dominance. So when Brics announced the launch of its own currency and India declared in 2022 that it would conduct trade in rupees, it was inevitable that the US would react. Because if such moves succeed, especially in the context of the petrodollar, the dollar's dominance in oil trade, the consequences could be catastrophic for America. A weakened dollar would mean a weakened America. And the question that naturally follows is, will the US allow this shift to happen peacefully? Or will it resort once again to the same tactics, intervention, pressure, and economic warfare to protect its global control? America won't be able to do whatever it wants now because Brics has become a powerful force. India is firm on trading in its own currency, the rupee. This isn't a new idea either. As I said earlier, during the 1950s and 60s, the Indian rupee held immense value and was widely accepted even in the Middle East. After independence in 1947, despite the British departure, many countries, especially in the Gulf region, continued to use Indian currency. Until the 1960s, the rupee was stable and widely trusted in nations like the UAE, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. But then a series of events changed everything. In 1962, India went to war with China. Just a few years later, in 1965, another war broke out with Pakistan. And in 1966, Bihar suffered a massive and devastating drought and flood, worsening the country's economic condition. Within 3 years, India had fought 2 wars and endured a natural disaster. The result? Exports dried up, imports surged, and economic pressure started mounting. During this fragile time, Indian currency was still in use across the Gulf. But that created a problem. Gold was being smuggled into India from these countries. The rupee's presence abroad allowed smugglers to exploit the currency for gold trafficking. Gold was cheaper in the Gulf, and it flooded into India illegally. This distorted gold prices and weakened India's economic stability. To combat the crisis, the Reserve Bank of India took action. It realized that gold smuggling, driven by a shared currency, was damaging the Indian economy. So to prevent further economic harm and tackle the gold issue, RBI introduced a new rule. For the first time, a separate version of the Indian rupee would be printed exclusively for use in the Gulf countries. This marked a turning point, ending the era of one currency dominance in the region and starting a new phase of India asserting monetary control in the face of external challenges. It was a unique move, India introduced a special pink-colored currency known as the Z1 series, meant exclusively for countries like Oman, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia wasn't included in this list. However, since a large number of Indian Muslims visited Saudi Arabia every year for Hajj, the RBI issued yet another currency specifically for pilgrims, known as the Hajj currency. This currency could be easily converted into the Saudi riyal, reflecting the high value and trust in the Indian rupee at that time. So while the pink currency circulated in the Gulf nations, Hajj currency supported pilgrims visiting Mecca and Medina. But everything changed after the triple blow of 1962, 1965, and 1966. 2 wars and 1 devastating drought. India's financial condition began to worsen. Exports dried up, imports surged, expenses soared, and the GDP took a hit. Poverty reached new highs, and naturally, the value of the Indian rupee started to decline. Before this crisis, the dollar to rupee exchange rate stood proudly at $1 equals 4 Indian rupees. But by 1966, it had weakened to 7 Indian rupees 0.5 per dollar, a sharp fall of 3 Indian rupees 0.5. This depreciation alarmed the Gulf nations. They feared that if the Indian rupee kept weakening, their own economies, tied to this foreign currency, would also suffer. As a result, in 1966, these countries made a pivotal decision to stop using Indian currency altogether and start printing and circulating their own national currencies, effectively ending India's monetary influence in the region. From 1947 to 1965, the Indian currency was widely accepted and used in countries like Oman, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. But when the rupee sharply devalued, dropping by 3.5 rupees against the dollar, those nations decided to abandon it. To stabilize their own economies, they began issuing their own currencies like the dinar and dirham around 1966. Now imagine if the 1962 war with China, the 1965 war with Pakistan, and the devastating drought hadn't occurred. If the rupee hadn't lost value, India might have become the global currency power instead of the dollar. What makes this scenario even more ironic is that, at the time when Indian currency was still being used in the Gulf, no one had discovered the massive oil reserves lying beneath those nations. Just as India's rupee influence collapsed, those countries began finding oil, and with that discovery, their own newly launched currencies, like dirham, rial, and dinar, started to rise in power and value. Today, the tables have completely turned. For example, Kuwait's dinar, which replaced the rupee, now holds a value of 280 Indian rupees. That's right, 1 dinar equals 280 INR, and when converted to dollars, it equals approximately $3.24 similarly. Bahrain's dinar is now worth 239 Indian rupees, or $2.65. The Omani rial, around 225 rupees, or $2.60. Even Jordan, which once had little economic might, now has a dinar valued at 121 rupees. All of this paints a powerful picture of what could have been had the Indian rupee not faced those historical setbacks. In dollars, that value stands at just 1.41 rupees. Now imagine, what if instead of those setbacks, the Indian currency had remained dominant, and then India or the countries using the Indian rupee had discovered vast oil reserves? The global financial landscape could have looked very different. Perhaps the dollar wouldn't be the dominant force it is today. But unfortunately, history didn't align in India's favor. The wars, the drought, and the rapid devaluation of the rupee all struck at a crucial time, denying the Indian currency its rightful rise. Yet maybe the memory of that past influence is what inspired India in 2022 to announce a major move to start international trade in Indian rupees. This decision also gained traction when Brics nations collectively proposed launching their own currency. Together, Brics countries represent around 45% of the world's population and contribute roughly 37% to global GDP. If such a large bloc begins trading in local currencies or a new Brics currency, it would inevitably diminish the dominance of the US dollar. And if the dollar begins to fall, its power, its credibility, what comes next? America knows this well. That's why it is always alert, ensuring that the dollar remains strong at all costs. History has shown us how the US has responded to threats against the dollar's supremacy. Libya's Colonel Gaddafi and Iraq's Saddam Hussein both attempted to bypass the dollar in oil trade, and we all know what happened to them and their nations. So it's not a stretch to believe that any challenge to the dollar is met with fierce retaliation. But the fact remains, if the dollar and its petrodollar system ever collapse, and if another currency gains global status, it would directly shake America's grip on global power. And while this scenario may seem distant, it is no longer a fantasy. It is not only possible, it is already in motion. The world is changing, and in the coming years, efforts to shift away from the dollar will only intensify. To challenge the dominance and arrogance of the dollar, several parallel international currencies have started gaining traction as potential competitors. Until now, global trade has largely revolved around a few major currencies, primarily the US dollar, the British pound, and the Japanese yen. But out of all these, the dollar still accounts for a massive 96% of international transactions. Countries that hold dollar reserves in their central banks automatically gain a trading advantage. That's because their economic strength can be gauged by the volume of dollar and gold reserve they possess. India, sensing the shift in global power dynamics, has begun significantly increasing its gold reserves. This strategic move is beginning to concern the United States. The fear is clear. If India, along with other Brics nations, becomes strong enough to introduce and standardize their own trading currency, it could directly challenge the dollar's supremacy. China's yuan is already becoming a formidable force in global markets, and given that China is also a core member of Brics, the threat to the dollar only grows stronger. Looking ahead, especially if political dynamics in the US remain volatile, for example, if Donald Trump returns to power, then any shakeup in the dollar's position could cause a rapid decline in American global influence. Many believe that such a decline would bring an end to the era of Western economic dominance, marked by manipulation and bullying tactics. If the dollar crumbles, America's image as a global superpower may collapse with it. So the world is at a tipping point. Major changes could be right around the corner. That wraps up today's story. If today's story gave you chills, then believe me, this is just the beginning. The Last Clue brings you true stories every week, real, disturbing, and drawn straight from the darkest corners of the human mind. If you're someone who's fascinated by true crime, psychological thrillers, political, secret operation, celebrity life, world history, unsolved mysteries, and all of Verity's stories, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because the next story might be the one that keeps you up at night. Subscribe because the truth won't wait. I'll return next time with another gripping and unforgettable tale. Until then, take care of yourself and your loved ones and stay safe. We'll meet again on Monday at 6 p.m. India time with another fascinating topic. Until then, feel free to explore the rest of our stories. Thank you so much.